whatever it is, as long as it provokes the receiving of the information. This is the critical issue, yeah?
Really, nothing exists in what we do. Nothing exists because by its nature, it is ephemeral. It is a passing living thing. So that, or it exists in a temporal world. We're not talking about a still photograph. We're talking about a movie or a piece of motion work. So it exists over a course of time. And as such, a piece of film curled up in a canister sitting on a shelf, or a videotape sitting on a shelf, that's not a movie. What that is a transport device for that movie. But you have message, you have sender, you have message, and you have receiver, and you have device along the way to make that happen. But it doesn't exist until it reaches the receiver. And that is when the cycle is completed. So the argument of, well, if something isn't existing in the temporal world as a physical thing, then it doesn't make it real. I say that's a spurious argument, because at a certain point I can say in metaphysics, in the grandest scheme of things, you can look at Einstein, and you can say that electricity and flow of energy is at a certain point the same as material good. You can turn matter into energy and energy into matter, and that's where the nuclear bombs came from. Well, at that point I would say that there is no reason that a piece of film that is physical matter has greater value per se than an electrical signal, which is a form of energy. They are, in abstracts and in absolutes, the same thing. And it's really not important because it's just a means to an end. You're really talking about just this thing to get you to wherever you want to go. And where you want to go is you, as the artist and the craftsperson and the group that you're working with, go and do this work in order to get it transferred along the way to eventually end up in a receiver's, through their eyes and their ears and into their brain, processed together to create an effect. And that's making a movie. Everything else, who cares?
Okay, I'm going to give you the chance now to, you were talking about, this is the kind of sum up bit, or to throw up even a question. It depends where you want to go. But I just want to offer up an opening place for that. You can use it or chuck it. When I was talking to Dave Stump and Scott Billups, because I had the two of them together, you should have seen an interesting interview.
I bet they were bouncing off each other a lot.
It was very funny. I mean, I have these stitches all the time. But so I come in with my kind of question like, so we've got 2K, and you know now we've got 4K, and the Japanese are working with 8K. Do you think this will be 16K or 32K? And they said, "Nah, you're asking the wrong question." Because Scott, no, it's actually Dave Stump that was saying that that we kind of guessed that. No, it's Scott. We guessed that or we've measured that the pathway between eye and brain is about 1.2 gigabytes of data. That was the rough. And you kind of...
Sure. No, it sounds about right. Yeah.
So, is that in any way provoking of some of the things you might want to say to sum up this entire thing about...
Well, I would say is, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter, because so often we throw away information. I mean, we just do all the time. And we don't have a choice. Me just looking at you right now, my periphery sees out to here, but my brain is focused there. Because, and I'm just ignoring the rest of it, because it's not what matters. And all that we care about is, or all we should care about is, what we want to make matter. We don't, I'll say it again, Alfred Hitchcock did not care about making a slice of life. He wanted to make a slice of cake. He wanted to take the part that he really cared about and present that. And so we just want to be able to take the information that we really care about and present that. The first thing that's really important about having super high resolution is you can take it and you can dumb it down. And because you're starting with more information, the same reason you want to take a really, really sharp lens, or you want to shoot in IMAX or 65 millimeter, even if it's going to go to a lesser format, is that everywhere along the way you're going to lose information. And so you want to get as much as you can, and then filter your way down to get as much of the stuff that's important to you to come through. Because that's all that matters, is what's important to you as the craftsperson, as the artist, to try and get that across. Everything else, so what? Really?
Perfect place to end.
Let me just throw out one other little technical thing,
okay.
which is CCD versus CMOS.
I was going to talk about this earlier.
They're a different type of sensor.
Yeah.
And then global shutter versus rolling shutter. And everyone, because of just the evolution of the way things happened in technology, there's a lot of people who assume that a CCD has a global shutter and a CMOS sensor has a rolling shutter. And it's not necessarily true. We have some cameras that are CMOS sensors that have global shutters. We have some CCD sensors that have rolling shutter. The difference between a rolling shutter and a global shutter is a global shutter takes the information. Every single little photo site has a driver that can just pull the information from it directly, and a global shutter does it all at once. And a rolling shutter scans. It starts at the top and it says, "All right, I'm going to take the information from this line, and this line, this line, this line." And it actually kind of cascades it. It's like I get a little bit through this line, then I can start on the next, and I can start on the next, and it kind of wipes it all through. The effect is that if you have information moving in your frame all the time, you can kind of bend things because, well, the moment that it captured from up here is very different from when it captured down there. But it doesn't. But for most things, you can't see it. And what people forget about is the fact that film is a form of rolling shutter.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't just instantly have the mechanical shutter come in there. And some shutters curve this way, some roll that way. Some have a leaf that comes down and then passes.
Yeah.
Different.
But the wisdom up until now is that CCDs discharge bit by bit, whereas CMOS is discharged fully.
It's not even that. It's as much as they're very different technologies, and a charged coupled device versus a chemical device, and interestingly enough, by the way, CCDs and CMOS sensors, what they actually are, they're analog devices. It's actually a piece of analog technology, and then it just has it's an electrical sensor and it has a value coming through. Excuse me, that's my wife. Hi, B. I'm just finishing up an interview and on camera, and I will call you right back. Okay. All right. Bye.
Okay, so that's great. This is hey, listen. This is what's I love the fact. I've just got to show the camera.
Did I
only know
my
one
phone?
other person that's got something as fancy as that.
Yeah. Well, it's I have values in my life, and I also have children who pick things up sometimes.
So in that, okay.
So a CCD and a CMOS sensor, they work differently, and CCDs came first, and it's just as a piece of technology was discovered first, and so there's been a much longer evolution of CCD technology. So if it started here and it was kind of crappy looking, and then it got up to a certain point and it looks really nice. CMOS is a much younger technology, but it's quickly coming up to it, and I believe that in time CMOS will just surpass CCD as a type of technology, a type of an image gathering sensor. And whether you have global shutter or rolling shutter, part of the reason of having a rolling shutter is that then you don't need something on every single little photo site, because it's a wafer, it's a panel, if you will, and there's certain technologies that kind of can put something behind it, but otherwise, think of pixels, think of the photo sites as a grid and little squares. And if here's one square, well, if you have to have that driver there to take the information away, then maybe only this much of your square is actually the image gathering information spot, the photosensitive photo site, and the rest of it is the circuitry for the driver. Well, now what's called your fill factor has dropped because it's smaller. So smaller little bucket to gather light, it's going to gather less light, less information. So it's not as sensitive. And you want to have a higher fill factor. Well, what do? They start putting a little lens over that entire square to magnify everything down into that one area. So you raise your fill factor some. But another way you can raise your fill factor is, well, let's just have it scan, and so it can be something behind it, so you can have a much bigger area that's a photo site. And that is a good argument for having a rolling shutter. Also, not all rolling shutters are the same. Still cameras that take an image and have a mechanical shutter that pops up and down to help get the image. The mirror goes, but also actually a little piece of material, just a little leaf that flip and behind it. That, it doesn't care because it shoots it still, and then it scans everything off and puts it to the next data mode before it goes and is ready to do the next frame. Well, that's very different than a motion picture camera that has to keep it moving. So you have different cameras that can have, this is only a microsecond, or this is a millisecond to do it, and this one, well, that one might take 12 microseconds or 14, or this one's only 7. And what does that mean? Well, just take a camera and pan back and forth. And in fact, that little camera right there, if you pan that back and forth, your vertical lines are going to start doing this because it doesn't scan it particularly quickly. And if you take another one that scans very quickly, then your vertical lines will remain vertical. And that can be a real issue, depending on the type of photography.
How do you feel? I mean, seeing as we've gone there, we might as well go to the last bit, which is, how do you feel about? I forgot the technical name for it, but the kind of sensor or the kind of system that says, here's an exposure at this level and here's an exposure at this level, and let's mitigate the damage. In other words, if we took an exposure at one level, something would be too hot, something would be too dark. If we take an exposure at the highest level and we take an exposure at the lowest level, we can take the best of both and put them together.
The HDR, the high dynamic range sensoring, I think it's actually quite fabulous. If there's a lot of ways to skin that cat, and depending on how you're doing high dynamic range sensoring, I think that's going to be something for the future. There are ways you could, one of the simplest ways is you could put a prism, like, back to those 3-chip cameras. Well, what if you had like a 2-chip one, and one was sent to a set at, maybe it's through a filter, was at a really low sensitivity, and one was at a really high sensitivity. Now you can take those two images and you can merge them, and you get all your highlights in the one that's really low sensitivity, and the one that's really high sensitivity can see deeply into the shadows. Okay, that could work, except that you've just cut down the sensitivity of your camera in half because it's got to go through a prism that's going to split it to two things. And then behind, how much space and stuff like that, it becomes a different kind of machine. There is value to all these ideas. I think there's lots of other ways that this technology is being made to work and to be experimented upon. Some of them have just different ways of valuing sensitivity on a photo site. So you have what's called overfill. So there's different terms, but at least one manufacturer refers to it as overfill, which is, right now, if you have a little photo site and you saturate it, so much light hits it that it says it's 100%. I can't see anymore. Well, that's an overexposed image. At least that photo site, it's at pure white. Anything more, it's clipped. It can't have any more information. Done. Well, a lot of these sensors actually have the ability to see much further. It's just that in the processing along the way, that the area that you could store that information was only so big, and so you filled that up. Well, what if you have an overflow? So that once it reaches 100%, that little box says, okay, take this as a times 10. Sometimes when people write something on a calculator, if the numbers are too big to fit across the screen, it just says this number times 10. And then you can get a lot more information in there all of a sudden. So you say, all right, well, let's let it go up to that next level. And you have a much bigger range that it can see. And then you set a little notation in it that the processing can figure out later, saying, all right, that's actually in that next range of exposure. That's another way of doing high dynamic range. And there's the thing about, there's issues with temporal speed of how quickly it can react to these things. But these are all not insurmountable problems. These are ways, these are smarter people than I doing clever engineering principles to find ways past it, so that you can find a way to go and create a higher dynamic range. And really, if you look at a high dynamic range image, it looks terrible. It looks like garbage because we can't see super high dynamic range. We can't see all that exposure range. So what you're going to do to represent it all, you're just going to flatten it all out. And then, from your brightest to your darkest, it's milky kind of gray. But then you can just dig deeply into each whatever segments of it, and then you're going to choose, well, I need a little bit more information in out that window. Let me darken that effectively so that I can see that out there while maintaining my exposure indoors. And that shadow area, I want to be able to see a little detail in that cabinet in the corner. Bring that up a little bit. And you have room to do it because all that information is sort of floating in the background. But it goes back to what I said before about technology and its limitations, and who cares about what it can and can't do at a certain point, because really what we do all the time is take an image that has a huge range to it, and we clamp down on that range real fast. We make things more contrasty. We make it more dramatic looking all the time. I mean, that's just the most, people they look at, this camera can deliver me this image that's this smooth, creamy. Yeah, great, okay, let's put the key light over here and give them an edge right now. Boom, and give me some contrast to, make an interesting looking image out of it. So who cares if it's technically capable of doing it if I don't plan on ever using it?
Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to add in terms of, anything really? I mean, we've kind of...
One of the things that we're seeing now, first off, people talk about uncompressed. Oh, I've got to have uncompressed and whatever. You really have to have uncompressed. Uncompressed is nice, but I always say be careful what you ask for, because now you got to deal with it. Vast amounts of data that you're going to have to sit there and process.
Oh my God, I forgot to ask you one of the principal things has been DCTs and wavelet transforms.
It's different ways of compressing an image and different ways of a file structure, and whether something is compatible with a signal, a system, and it's you don't want to talk to me about that. I'd say. I mean, you have other people who probably can.
Well, no, nobody's been quite there. But I tell you what, I find myself. We got in a couple of days ago, so I'm kind of jet lagged and a bit gaga, which is why I can't remember the name of it.
Well, you have different ways that you can compress an image. It's different ways that you can.
But wavelets are recent, right? I mean,
wavelet compression is a relatively recent way of compressing a signal. You have again, there's different structures that you can approach towards compressing an image in order, and a series of images, so that you capture the most information that you would want to use. And so in motion work, people are finding that wavelet compression is a very smart way to be going.
People talk about DCTs like a meat grinder.
It becomes one of these things where I'm not going to speak against one versus the other than people are finding things like JPEG 2000 and Redcode and Cineform, ways that you're able to use what is referred to as a wavelet to gather more of the information that people find functional. One thing I did want to talk about is the changing physical form factor of a camera, because that gets into my heart. That's back as a cinematographer and as an application specialist, and like the doodads you bolt onto the side of a camera in order to make it work the way you want. A film camera had to be shaped a certain way because it had a mechanical operation. The film physically had to transport through and do certain things. But the one factor that's never changed is the human body. We're still the same, and we interact with a device the way that we interact with it. And it was nice when the physical size got to a point where the human body could actually do certain things to it. Remember that 35 motion pictures, that came about as this, you had this, stills were these big, cameras with a glass plate and the big bellows, and you throw your head behind it, and giant image. And then for motion pictures, it was, we can't physically afford, and the contraption to do it would be huge, the giant thing. And then when you had this motion picture system that was created, then as sort of almost an afterthought, you had this little company called Leica that said, hey, well, if I take that strip and I put it in a little canister, and I can make a little camera that's kind of small to walk around with, and you can take pictures instead of that big old, portrait camera, snap and thing, a little box, whatever, or a brownie camera or whatever. This tiny little strip of film was considered this really small thing, this little tiny little box. But what's been happening in recent years is you have smaller and smaller cameras with a much higher quality image that are coming out of them. So Panasonic and Sony and Canon have been coming out with cameras yay big that I refer to as sort of the compact HD or the handycam type cameras that all float out here, and then your arm gets really tired and you start to do that. And now there's what we call the HDSLRs, which are still cameras that have video capability, and they have a frighteningly good video capability out of them. But the problem is that as a still camera in general is designed to go like that, and you adjust it, snap, and you're done with it. You grab that one shot. And for motion picture work, for moving images, that doesn't work so well. You get a lot of this, and you get an odd jitter to it. And also, by nature of the way these cameras work, you can't look through the eyepiece, and so you're looking at this little LCD screen, and you can back it up, and now you're like this. And now it's really uncomfortable, and now it really shakes a lot. And then now there's these contraptions that go onto your shoulder and try to put some weight back there, and you balance, and you're like this, and suddenly this camera that was so great because it was only this big, now is this giant thing like this, and you're like, well, what? And I firmly believe that, first off, a camera for stills is nice shaped like this, but a camera for motion is kind of nice shaped like that because it works with your body in general. But I also believe that we are going to see a time where we separate the physical form of what the box is from what we need. And that's actually going to free us in a way that we have not seen up to this point. Because all I really need is something to get to my eye and a lens that I can interact with. And I want to be able to put it on a tripod. I want to be able to put it on my shoulder. I want to be able to stick it over here. I want to be able to mount it real quick there. I want to be able to do whatever I want with it and somehow can interact with it. And every aspect of it, whether it's the recording of it, whether it's the getting it to my eye, whether it's getting it out to the rest of the world, whether it's however it mounts, all of those things are now no longer, they don't necessarily have to be absolutely physically, mechanically locked to one another. And that's a dogma that we have from years, decades upon decades of what a camera physically had to be. And it doesn't have to be that anymore. And I'm still waiting to see the day when someone can truly step past. Because what everyone does is say, well, let me try to make this new tool that is familiar to what you're used to. And there is a great validity to that. To take what is the shape of a camera that everyone is used to and they like the way that works, and say, all right, well, let me make this thing work that way for you, because then you can work the way you're used to working. But there's the other side to it, which is to say, let's free yourself. Maybe there's a better way for you. Maybe there's something that, when I say this, the old line about people come up to me, and say, I have this new idea, and well, frankly, people have been doing this for 100 years, they figured it out. Well, for the last 100 years or so, you had to do it a certain way because the physical universe of what the devices you were using, they couldn't function another way. But what if you could? What if your lens only needed to be that big? What if it was a liquid lens? What if your sensor was the size of a postage stamp? What if the entire camera only needed to be this big? What if? What if it was something that went to your eye and then it wirelessly made it to the rest of the thing? What if you wanted something that you could mount so that you could have your body lean against it? What if you wanted to interchange those things? What if you wanted to have something that was in your hand here and then be able to do that and your body doesn't move? I'm not saying that's better. I'm saying it's different, and it's about making things available to you. What if you had a Steadicam that was that big and you could hold it in your finger, and wherever you moved your finger, that part balanced to that part to that part, and you could just do that? That might be really neat. It might suck too, I don't know, but let's try it. We have the options now of being able to do things that we just simply couldn't do before because the technology has arrived at that point. And I truly believe that in the next few years, people look back on this and they'll be like, oh, well, that was nothing. We could have done whatever. In the next few years, we're going to see a real sea change of what that sort of physicality and our interaction to our image capture devices will be. And that will free us, and we'll be able to create imagery that we haven't been able to create before. And you can look through history of devices that have suddenly allowed people to do it. I mean, you can look at the French New Wave when Eclair came out with a shoulder-mountable, 16 camera and just run around, sync sound, and be able to do it. And suddenly, Godard and others were making films that were vastly unlike things that had been done before, and were in fact even a statement against them. And then you can look at the Steadicam, and when it came along, and it was a tool like any other tool, but it allowed filmmakers to express in a certain way. And with any tool, what will happen is that, suddenly, the zoom lens arrived, and zoom, 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 zoom. And then people kind of calmed down and said, all right, well, here's a way that I could use this as a tool to create a look that I might want to get that I can't do otherwise. And I don't know what those things are going to be. I'm just here to try and help provide artists with tools. And someone's going to come up with something, and it's going to be a really different way of thinking. And then some artist out there is going to be looking at that and go, what if I tried this? Using that, and it's going to be able to create an image that you could not have done otherwise. And that, to me, is really exciting.